If anyone is listening to this recording, I hope you'll understand how things began to unravel, how one by one each small fracture in routine became a fissure in my sanity, and how the last, most human thing I had was the memory of a voice on the other end of a dying line. When I arrived at the station, deep in the subarctic wastes where even the wind sounded like static and the light bent in ways that made you question the hours, I believed in the protocol, in the sequence of check-ins and data uplinks, and the rotating duties that kept us clinging to purpose. They flew me in on a grey morning, clouds pressed so low to the ground that the sky felt heavy as lead. No one spoke on the chopper, not even the pilot. It was only after we landed, and I heard the hiss of the hydraulic hatch sealing me in, that I realized how absolute the silence could be out here. The airlock closed with a finality that I felt in my chest, like a held breath. The corridor beyond was bathed in that artificial blue that makes skin look bloodless, humming softly with the life support system's endless churn. I was to relieve Keller, whose only greeting as he passed me was a hollow-eyed stare and a mumble I couldn't decipher. His bag was already at the door. I watched him walk away through the viewport, one slow step after another, until he disappeared into the swirl of snow, swallowed whole by the white. My first days were mechanical: diagnostics, status reports, inventory. You keep busy, you don't let the silence in. There's always a code to check, a pressure reading to log, a meal to heat up in the humming galley while the wind claws at the walls. At night, the only company was the tick of relays and the slow drip from the condensation pipes above the comms desk. I tried not to think of Keller's expression, but every station hand knows the first week is the easiest. You still remember what the world sounds like: cities at dawn, traffic lights changing, the overlapping voices of strangers in a cafe. You can almost hear them, faint and far away, when you close your eyes in the dark. The hard part comes later, when the routines start to blur and every noise means something else. Control's first call was on schedule, 3 days in. A burst of digital squelch, the voice of someone called Donovan on the other end, clipped and official, asking for the uplink of atmospheric readings, magnetometer logs, the usual small talk meant to keep you sane. Report in at 06 and 08 in. Maintain daily logs. If the secondary antenna array pings a signal, record and relay immediately. You're not to open the emergency hatch under any circumstances. Acknowledge. I acknowledged. I noted it in the log. I read the section in the protocol binder. All 32 pages of red letter warnings about the hatch on the lower level, the one that led to the sub-basement access tunnel, long since abandoned, I was told, a relic from the first build of the station, now just a sealed chamber full of cold and shadows. I asked, as you do, if there was any particular reason for the emphasis. Donovan's reply was instantaneous. It's just protocol. We're monitoring for possible contamination, seismic events. Don't open the hatch. If you hear anything, report and wait for instructions. There was a pause, a faint click in the line, as if someone else was listening. Previous occupants sometimes reported odd noises. Environmental, we think. Ignore them. And so days became weeks, measured out in transmissions, data checks, meals eaten standing in the blue glow of the kitchen. The outside world shrank to a sequence of numbers and static bursts. I started sleeping less, finding excuses to pace the length of the central corridor, counting each footfall to convince myself I was still anchored. The wind changed notes sometimes, a higher whistle as it scraped the metal seams. And on those nights the station creaked like a ship under strain. The isolation settled in, slow and corrosive, like a leak you only notice after the air's already changed. Then came the morning when control didn't call. I checked the clock, checked the link, reset the uplink module, even climbed the cold rungs to the antenna bay to see if ice had sheared a cable. Nothing. No storm outside. Nothing unusual in the diagnostics. I logged the event. Another 6 hours passed. Still silence. The official line was to wait, maintain, and conserve power. On the second day, I tried the secondary channel. Only static. On the third, I sent a blind transmission, just my voice, flat and formal, giving readings into the void. I listened to the playback. My voice sounded strange, thinner, as if the machine had squeezed some of the life out of it. I logged every attempt, watching the dates tick over, growing less certain with each entry whether I was recording for someone out there or just for myself. It was the fourth day without contact when I began to feel the station had become a sealed world, a capsule drifting in its own orbit, unmoored from whatever was left of outside. The familiar noises, fan hum, the grind of the pump, the crack of ice on the frame became both comfort and threat. The wind outside stopped, and the silence pressed in so hard I thought I could hear my own heartbeat echoing back through the ductwork. That was when the station's systems started to falter. But that's not this part of the story. Before things really began to unravel, before the boundaries between the real and imagined blurred beyond repair, there was that last transmission, a voice on the line, brief and sharp, almost lost in the hiss. Repeat, do not open the hatch. No matter what you hear, no matter who calls, you are not alone down there. Then a burst of static, and then nothing but the hum of empty channels, a line cut forever, leaving me in the dark with a warning I would soon come to understand was not meant only for me. In the days that followed the last transmission, the air inside the station took on a peculiar weight, as if the molecules themselves were pressing closer to my skin, thickening with each minute that passed without the relief of a voice from outside. The structure, once merely an elaborate cage of steel and composites, now felt less like a marvel of engineering and more like the tomb for a mind left to ricochet off its own memories. The sequence of daily checks, those once comforting rituals, the charting of oxygen levels, the inspection of the weather instruments on the wind-scoured roof, the endless review of the data feeds that no one would ever read, began to feel like the mechanical gestures of a lost soul, their purpose decaying beneath the rhythm of repetition. In the beginning, I convinced myself it was only a temporary blackout. These things happen at the edge of the world. Sunspots, freak atmospheric distortions, frozen relaisony of a dozen technical reasons could explain why command had gone silent. But I became aware, with a creeping sense of dread, that the silence inside the station had a different quality than the silence outside. Out there, the world could be explained by physics, by the howling wind, by temperature and pressure, by the nothingness that stretched across the horizon. In here, the silence was dense with memory and possibility, filled with the ghosts of the ones who came before. The knowledge that everything that made me human, my routines, my identity, my sense of time depended entirely on some structure beyond my own mind. I started recording my own voice more often, talking into the handheld just to hear another person, even if that person was myself. I played backlogs of Keller's notes, searching for some hidden cadence in his clipped phrases, some warning embedded in his silences. He had never once mentioned the hatch. Not directly, but in one of the earliest files, I caught a moment, just a breath, just a faint hesitation before he changed the subject after a loud metallic echo in the background. The hatch, always the hatch, was referenced only as a location to avoid during maintenance or secure in severe weather. I found myself circling that lower corridor more than necessary, eyes drifting to the reinforced seal, the yellow tape still half peeled from some forgotten inspection. At night, when sleep wouldn't come, I would stare at the security cam feed in the control room, watching the pixels flicker in the dark just outside the hatch, inventing movement in the grain. The camera itself had begun to develop an irregular static, as if something unseen was brushing against the lens, or as if the cold had finally gotten into the wiring. As my routines grew more brittle, I became more obsessive, more careful. Each system check was performed twice, sometimes 3 times, as though repetition might fill the hollow left by the absence of instruction. I counted the meal packs, noted each ration's weight, even measured out my water with a precision that would have been absurd just weeks ago. The isolation gnawed at my confidence. Was I forgetting things, or simply not remembering them right? I left notes for myself, reminders on the console, my handwriting gradually slanting as the days wore on. I would wake up in the dark and listen for the hum of the generator, the faint buzz of the relays, any sound that confirmed the world was still ticking, that I was not the last living thing in a dead place. But there were nights, and these became more frequent, when the only sound was the rush of my own blood in my ears, the thrum of my heart like footsteps on a faraway floor. I began to suspect that the isolation was playing tricks on me, that the station was both a mirror and a labyrinth, reflecting my anxieties back in endless distorted echoes. The light panels above the corridor would sometimes flicker in sequence, as if marking the passage of something unseen down the length of the hall. The cold became unpredictable, settling in corners that had always been warm, curling around my ankles as I passed the main hatchway. Sometimes I would catch the scent of something unfamiliar, metallic tamps, a trace of ozone or something darker, like burnt insulation, lingering near the ventilation intake that ran down to the sublevel. The rational part of my mind fought back, cataloguing each anomaly, writing it off as equipment aging poorly or the effects of the environment. But I could not ignore the sense of being watched, a prickling awareness that grew sharper each time I neared the forbidden hatch. I took to checking the locks, not just on the hatch below, but on every access point, every emergency lever and tool locker. I slept with the handheld transceiver on my chest, its volume turned up so I would hear even the faintest whisper of signal. I dreamed of the outside world in fractured vignette subway cars full of strangers, city streets at sunset, my own face reflected in the window of a train. Sometimes, in the haze before waking, I thought I could hear footsteps above my head, pacing the length of the station in perfect time with my pulse. One afternoon, as I sat in the control room reviewing the log of system events, I heard a distant clang, like metal shifting against metal, echoing up from somewhere deep in the substructure. The sound froze me in place, every hair on my arms standing on end. I waited, listening for the repetition that would prove it was nothing more than the station settling. But the silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum so complete it swallowed even the sound of my own breathing. The isolation began to erode my sense of order. I started misplacing things: a screwdriver, a ration bar, a notebook full of maintenance, notes only to find them later in places I would never have left them. I began to doubt my own routines, second-guessing each step, wondering if I had really checked the seals or if I had only imagined it. The sense of presence grew heavier, not always threatening, but always there, a weight at the back of my mind that refused to be shaken loose. I became convinced that something in the station itself was aware of me, tracking my movements, anticipating my next step. The boundaries between the days blurred, and time became an indistinct smear, marked only by the cycles of the generators and the slow depletion of my supplies. The dreams intensified, shifting from nostalgia to something darker. I would find myself standing in front of the hatch, unable to move, as a shadow pressed against the metal from the other side, its outline shifting and swelling with each breath I took. In the dream, I could hear my own voice, thin and desperate, calling out for someone to answer, but the only reply was a muffled echo, as if someone far below was repeating every word. I would wake up drenched in sweat, certain that I had heard the hatch rattle, certain that I was not alone. It was then, in the grip of such dreams, that the rituals of routine became not just a means of survival but a desperate ward against the encroaching sense of unreality. Each task completed, each log entry made, was an anchor thrown into the black, an attempt to tether myself to something solid in the growing sea of uncertainty. Still, I clung to hope that control would break through, that the silence would end and the station would again become a node in the vast network of voices stretching across the ice. But with every hour, the possibility receded and the isolation deepened, becoming not just a condition but a presence, a shadow that stretched longer and colder with each passing day. By the end of the second week, I no longer trusted the boundaries of the station or the boundaries of my mind. I could only wait, trapped within the routines that had once defined my existence, listening for the knock that would finally shatter the silence, wondering if I would recognize my own voice when I heard it answer from the other side. The decay began so quietly, I almost believed it was my own exhaustion playing tricks on the senses. There were always minor failures in the cold, always glitches and stutters from the battered electronics, always that expectation that something would freeze, stutter, or flicker and require nothing more than a stern look and a reset, like scolding a stubborn child. It was the nature of the place, after all, suspended so far from everything that even a single blown fuse felt like a message from the void. But soon the failures no longer seemed like routine inconveniences. They started to stack up, each one small on its own, an lead warning here, a longer reboot time there, the temperature dropping a fraction of a degree in rooms that were always warm before. It was the way the coffee never quite boiled, the way the lights over the corridor dimmed for a split second and came back a shade duller, the way the wind outside seemed to press a little harder against the walls, as if it could sense the weakening inside. The air recycler shuddered once, sending a sharp metallic buzz through the ducts that set my teeth on edge, and I spent a whole night tracing the sound, convinced there was something loose in the intake grill. I found nothing but the usual frost, the slow accumulation of dust. Still, I double-checked the filters, logged the anomaly, and told myself that vigilance was just another way to mark the passing hours. On the 5th day since Control's last transmission, the station's diagnostics panel flashed amber across 3 systems at once. Power, comms, and environmental. A simple power fluctuation would not have worried me, but this was different. Each warning cycled in and out, flickering as though something was interfering not just with the hardware, but with the nervous system of the entire station. I ran full diagnostic sweeps, and the readouts shifted subtly each time, parameters drifting in small increments that didn't match any familiar pattern. Sometimes the system would insist all was normal, only to deliver a cascade of error codes the next minute. I lost several hours that day in a haze of troubleshooting, crawling behind panels, feeling the static prickling in the back of my neck, the cold edge of the metal biting into my fingers as I tightened connections and reseated chips. I found myself muttering to the machines, begging them not to let me down, apologizing for every angry thought I had ever directed at their worn circuits. It felt as if the station had become fragile, like a living thing growing sick from within. Sleep grew thinner and more agitated. I woke from shallow dreams to the sound of the comms array chirping static, the old radio cycle stuck in a loop, a rhythmic pulse like a heartbeat or a code. I would stumble from my bunk and stand by the console, watching the green lights flicker and fade, listening for something hidden in the white noise, some faint signal from the world outside. I played back old logs, but even they seemed to degrade, snippets missing. The audio warped as if my own words were being erased by the station itself. I tried calling out on every channel, rehearsing the same calm introduction, my voice growing hoarse and strange, until it began to sound less like me and more like an imitation flat. Mechanical, distorted by a layer of fatigue that never quite lifted. The environmental system was next. Condensation began to form in places it never had before, beads of moisture trickling down the bulkheads, collecting at the base of the CUMS desk and leaving a persistent chill in the air. I adjusted the settings, recalibrated the sensors, but each morning the readings crept downward, as if some slow entropy was seeping through the walls. The emergency heating panel in the crew galley glowed a dull, exhausted red, never reaching the set point, its warmth paling against the deepening cold. I layered on extra clothing, gloves, and hats, and sat for long hours wrapped in the fraying blanket Keller had left behind, my breath steaming in the air as I tapped out diagnostics on a handheld keypad, the chill gnawing at my fingers. The doors became temperamental, sliding open and shut with a reluctance that seemed almost conscious. Once, the main corridor hatch jammed half open, grinding and screeching until I finally forced it closed, heart racing, muscles aching from the effort. The feeling that the station itself was resisting me, that I was an intruder or an afterthought, grew with each mechanical failure. I began to imagine that the place had grown tired of humans, that it would rather sit in silent decay than endure another round of our desperate routines. The worst of it was the power system. At first, just a flicker lights dimming, the fridge humming a shade too loud, a brief loss of uplink power that was easily fixed. Then the brownouts began in earnest, rolling through the station at odd hours, each one longer than the last. The battery backups engaged automatically, but the battery readings never seemed to match what I remembered from the day before. The generator, a squat relic humming in its insulated alcove, began to cough and stutter, the smell of diesel thickening in the vents. I spent an entire afternoon in the sublevel, swaddled in a parka and clutching a flashlight, cleaning filters and checking lines, chasing phantoms in the dim blue light as the temperature dropped another degree. I was never certain if I was truly alone down there. The tunnels echoed with the scuff of my boots and the distant hollow tick of some unseen mechanism, repeating at intervals that never matched my own steps. I became convinced that the station was trying to tell me something, some warning encoded in the rhythm of its breakdowns, a logic hidden in the pattern of failures. Sometimes, as I sat by the CUMS panel listening to the static, I would catch a hint of structure in the noise, a rhythm or a voice just beneath the threshold of comprehension. I tried recording these fragments, hoping to decode them later, but the recordings always came out warped, corrupted by bursts of static and strange, overlapping sounds, clicks and whispers, and a low pulsing tone that seemed to throb in my chest. I kept to my routines as best I could, clinging to the last vestiges of order as the systems around me failed, one by one. Each night, before trying to sleep, I made a circuit of the station, checking every lock, every panel, every piece of equipment that still responded to touch or command. The emergency lighting threw long, distorted shadows against the walls, and I found myself flinching at every flicker, every unexpected sound. My notes became more frantic, filled with crossouts and corrections, the handwriting growing wild and uncertain. I began to lose track of the days, the steady march of time unraveling in the face of so much mechanical decay. My mind, always so disciplined, began to slip, looping through old memories and half-formed fears, searching for meaning in the silence. Then, on the 9th day, the main status board in the control room flashed red. The display listed every major system power, environment, comes as unstable, with a scrolling message at the bottom I didn't recognize. The code wasn't standard. It looked like a checksum error, but it repeated in a pattern I swore I had seen before, somewhere deep in the logs or maybe in one of Keller's last frantic notes. I traced it back, line by line, through weeks of data, until I found a nearly identical error from a year prior. The file was tagged unexplained, do not modify. The note attached was from control. If persistent, contact command. Do not attempt access to sublevel. Do not open lower hatch. Await instructions. As I stared at the words, the hatch camera flickered and went dark. The feed did not return. That was when the sounds began again, sharper and closer than before, metal on metal. A steady tap, sometimes a shuffling, sometimes a hollow thud, like something heavy sliding into place. I sat awake through the night, staring at the camera feeds and the blank screen where the hatch should have been, listening to the station groan as the temperature dropped, the air thickening with condensation, the lights flickering so much I could barely see my own hands. I heard my name, once, faint and stretched, echoing through the static on the come so quiet I could have dismissed it, if not for the way my skin prickled and my breath caught. I tried to convince myself it was only fatigue, a mind worn thin by fear and monotony, but the sounds persisted, sometimes receding, sometimes so near I felt sure the metal would buckle. The warnings from control echoed in my mind. Do not open the hatch. Do not trust what you hear. Do not listen to the voices in the dark. Every system was failing, one by one. The station and its occupant unraveling together, as if something in the dark had always been waiting for this moment, had always known that isolation is not only a prison but a door, and some doors, once weakened, become impossible to keep closed. The worst thing about isolation is the way it makes you question the reality of every sensation. I remember sitting by the dim light of the failing control room. The only sounds the slow drip from a condensation line and the static pulse of the backup comes when I first registered the knock as something separate from the ordinary symphony of decay. It was faint at first, just a sharp tap on metal that could have been the normal settling of the station, a pipe adjusting to the cold, a bracket flexing beneath the pressure of the wind. I barely glanced up, too engrossed in tracking the error code crawling across the system monitor, too exhausted to catalogue another anomaly. My body had become accustomed to every manner of mechanical complaint, the way the doors hissed under pressure, the way the ducts clicked as temperatures shifted, the thud of the old generator kicking in and out of life. My mind ran on parallel tracks, one committed to the maintenance of fragile order, the other spiraling through memories and hallucinations conjured by sleep deprivation and fear. But the knock came again, unmistakable this time, a slow, deliberate rapping from somewhere deep below, reverberating up through the sublevel steel skeleton so that the floor beneath my feet seemed to tremble in sympathy. At first I froze, listening with the rigid stillness of an animal that senses a predator in the dark. The memory of control's last warning pressed in on me: do not open the hatch, no matter what you hear. I glanced at the monitor, where the feed from the hatch camera had long since gone dark, the square of static mocking my helplessness. Another knock, louder now, a pattern that seemed too regular for chance, too calculated for wind or thermal expansion. It came in threes, tap tap, a pause, then another set. The interval between each knock so precise it felt rehearsed, almost ritualistic. I clutched the portable transceiver in my hand, half expecting to hear some explanation break through the noise, someone from control, some engineer on a backup frequency, anything that would anchor the event in reality. But there was only the crackle of static, the dead air stretching on and on, broken only by the next series of knocks. I tried to reason with myself. There could be logical explanations, couldn't there? Some animal driven into the substructure by the cold, an icicle or rockfall dislodged by the ever-shifting permafrost, striking the old metal accessways below. But the knock was coming from the sealed side of the hatch, from a place that by all protocol and common sense should have been inaccessible, a compartment locked and left untouched since long before my assignment. I found myself walking the corridor, each step echoing with dread. The knowledge that I was truly alone now, given a rhythm and a voice by whatever was outside or inside the hatch. The sound followed me, faint but relentless, chasing me through the narrow confines of the station, amplifying every fear that had taken root during those long, wordless nights. I returned to the logbook, my hands shaking as I tried to record the events with clinical detachment. Time of anomaly, description of the sound, possible causes considered, all entered in the even, slanted script that had become less orderly with each passing day. But the words felt useless, powerless to contain the reality of the knock, to dispel the certainty growing in my chest that this was not the ordinary groaning of the structure. My mind leaped to Keller, the last technician, to the strange gaps in his logs, to the hesitation in his voice when he'd passed me in the entryway, the way he'd refused to meet my eyes. I wondered, then, what he'd heard during his last days here, what private terrors had followed him out into the white when his rotation ended. The protocols flashed in my mind: do not open the hatch, do not respond to unfamiliar noises, report and await further instruction. But control was gone, and I was left with only my own judgment and the growing sense that some boundary, once solid, was now dangerously thin. I tried distracting myself with maintenance tightening bolts, cleaning filters, recalibrating sensors, but the knock returned. Sometimes so soft I almost missed it, sometimes so loud it rattled the dishes in the galley. I began to count the intervals, searching for meaning in the sequence, mapping each occurrence in the margin of my notes. Was it a code, a signal, some desperate attempt at communication from a world I'd been told no longer existed beyond the sealed steel? I set up a handheld recorder by the hatch, left it running through the night, and played back the audio the next morning, only to hear the knock magnified and distorted, as if the microphone itself was struggling to capture something too vast or alien for its simple circuitry. There were hours of silence, stretches where I convinced myself it was over, that the knock had been nothing but a hallucination crafted by my own loneliness. But then, inevitably, the sound would return, echoing through the station like the memory of a voice you can't quite recall, a message left in a language you're no longer sure you speak. I paced the corridors, whispering to myself, trying out different explanations, listing possibilities until the logic of each dissolved under the weight of the repetition. I wondered if it had always been there, some ancient sound that had echoed through the structure since the day it was built, heard only by those unlucky enough to find themselves truly alone. Each night, the knock seemed to grow bolder, drawing nearer, its cadence more insistent, as if whatever was on the other side had learned the pattern of my movements, timing its calls to the moments when I was most vulnerable. I began to dread sleep, afraid of what I might hear in the silence, afraid of what I might do if the knock continued without answer. The routines that had kept me grounded, maintenance, logs, checklists, began to break down, replaced by a restless vigilance, an animal alertness to every creak and groan of the failing station. The air grew colder, my breath curling in the dim light, each exhale a small, visible proof that I still existed, still occupied this space, still had agency in the face of whatever was trying to communicate through the hatch. I could not escape the feeling that the knock was meant for me alone, that it was an answer to some unspoken question I had carried with me since the first day I arrived. It became the axis around which my thoughts revolved, a sound that was neither living nor dead, neither a warning nor an invitation, but something older and deeper than language. I wondered, as I sat awake through the endless polar night, if every technician before me had heard it too, If Keller and all the others had stood in this same corridor, frozen by the sound of knuckles on steel, debating whether to obey the protocols or to answer the summons, I stared at the hatch until my eyes burned, half expecting to see it bulge or bow inward, to see the seal begin to fail. But it held, silent but for the relentless, inhuman cadence of the knock. With each passing day, my certainty faded, replaced by a spiraling fear that the boundaries between the inside and the outside, between my thoughts and the reality of the station, were crumbling. The knock became the only thing I could trust, a constant presence in a world of failing systems and lost connections, a reminder that I was not, and never had been, truly alone. I began to wonder how long I could resist its call, how long I could hold out against the rising tide of isolation and the terrible, tantalizing promise contained in that simple, undeniable sound. And as the cold deepened and the station shuddered around me, I realized that the first knock was only the beginning, that the true test had not yet come, and that somewhere, just beyond the edge of hearing, something was waiting for my answer. There is a point in every prolonged isolation when the mind, craving contact, begins to fold inward on itself and spins out echoes from memory and fear. The station's days slipped into one another, a grey monotony punctuated only by the knock, which became so familiar that at times I felt I could predict its arrival, as though my own anticipation brought it forth. It was during one of those interminable nights, the wind outside barely a hush and the internal systems of the station quieter than I could bear, that I first heard the voice, not the metallic scrape or dull thump of another knock, but a distinct and unmistakably human sound, faint as if spoken through a thick wall of snow, and so like my own that I froze, convinced I must be dreaming, or worse, that I had finally crossed the threshold between solitude and madness. The voice came first as a murmur, something shapeless and hesitant, threading itself through the static of the comms array left idling on its last operational channel. My own voice, but not mine, as if it belonged to someone who remembered my life in fragments or had borrowed my cadence to mimic the ache in my words. I turned every dial, rechecked the frequency settings, replayed the logs in case I'd left a message running by accident. Nothing explained it. There was no source. The voice would fade as quickly as it had come, leaving behind the echo of its timbre in the low hum of the equipment, so close to my own that it set my nerves on edge. In the following days, the boundary between myself and that voice began to blur. I caught it whispering in places where it should not have been buried in the static of the failing intercom, warping through the feedback of the external microphones trained on the windward wall, even in the soft groan of the bulkheads at night. Sometimes it was a mere suggestion, the familiar inflection of my own exhaustion curdling into an alien undertone. Other times it was clearer, speaking my name with an urgency I had not felt since the last transmission from control, or repeating phrases I'd muttered to myself while pacing the corridor. It spoke in half-remembered sentences, recalling things I'd never said aloud but had thought only in my loneliest hours. The effect was cumulative, each recurrence tightening the spiral of my anxiety, making me second-guess not just the reality of the voice, but the integrity of my own memory. Was it a malfunctionsome recursive loop of audio, a feedback artifact from a dying sensor, or was the isolation finally manifesting in auditory hallucinations, the kind described in those dire sections of the protocol binder no one ever reads in full? I tried to test it, setting up the handheld recorder at different points throughout the station, playing back the tapes in the hope of catching the voice's true shape. Yet each time, the device only caught a thready confusion of static, my own breathing, the click of my tongue as I waited in silence, nothing else. But late at night, in that wavering hour when my mind teetered between sleep and waking, I would hear it more plainly, the words unspooling from the comms, or rising from the vents. Urgent, plaintive, perfectly aligned with my own fears. It began to ask questions, simple, devastating ones. Are you there? And why won't you answer me? Sometimes it pleaded, let me in, or it's so cold out here. Every time it used my own name, and every time the urge to respond, to reassure or defend myself, grew harder to resist. I started to speak aloud, just to have my real voice fill the emptiness. But the effort only served to heighten the sensation of being watched by something just out of sight, just behind the metal of the hatch, or perhaps in the shadowed glass of the blank monitors. Once, I found myself standing at the lower corridor at a strange hour, hand resting on the cold seal of the forbidden hatch. The knock had subsided, replaced by the steady rhythm of my own pulse in my ears, and somewhere beneath that, the ghostly echo of my voice, pleading for release. The feeling was not simply that of being called, but of being drawn to an obligation, as if all my training and habit had conspired to bring me to this point. I pressed my palm against the hatch, feeling the tremor of cold radiate up through my bones, and listened as the voice said my name again, softer now, more desperate than before. For a moment, I believed I could distinguish another figure behind it, a shadow pacing the dark beyond the hatch, shifting in time with my every movement. I retreated, heart pounding, the logic of protocol warring with the ancient need to comfort, to answer, to not be alone in this vast, silent place. The effect was cumulative. My sleep fractured into shallow intervals, always interrupted by the sound of my own name echoing from impossible places, the galley's steel sink, the comms room, the intercom beside the main entrance. The boundaries of the station no longer seemed as firm as before. Shadows lengthened and twisted in ways that defied the weak geometry of emergency lighting, and the cold became a presence in itself, heavy and insinuating, curling through the air like a fog. Even in my own logs, my handwriting had grown erratic, as if some other version of myself had begun to surface, scribbling warnings and apologies I did not recall writing. It became clear that the voice, whatever it was, had no intention of leaving, no more than the cold or the endless wind. It was part of the fabric of the station now, sewn into the walls and the wires, as much a resident as I was. Desperate for clarity, I tried contacting control once more, sending blind transmissions across every band, my own voice cracked and trembling spilling out into the void. I recited status reports, pleaded for instruction, confessed to hearing things I could not explain, but every attempt was met with only the relentless return of my own words. Distorted and rearranged, the line between message and echo lost. It was as if the entire network had been reconfigured into a loop, my fears and questions bouncing endlessly back to me, until I could no longer distinguish the origin. I understood then, in a way that no regulation or training manual could ever have prepared me for, why the hatch was never to be opened, why every technician who came before me left this place changed, hollowed, unable to look back. Still, the voice persisted. It became the rhythm of my days, the background music of my long, sleepless nights. Sometimes I thought it was trying to warn me, to share in my fear. Other times it seemed to mock, to tempt, to push me toward the hatch, as if daring me to betray every order I had ever trusted. The lines between myself and the other, between here and there, grew porous, as if the station itself was a membrane and the voice was simply the first thing to seep through. In the end, I could only write, record, and hope that somewhere in these endless layers of self, something would remain intact, something that could remember who I was before the voice, before the knock, before I became a question echoing in the dark. There is a strange comfort to be found in the relentless repetition of static, the white hiss that fills the void between broken signals, masking the emptiness that grows in silence. In the days after the voice began to mirror my every fear, I threw myself deeper into the mechanical rituals of the comms equipment, searching for any trace of the outside world, a pulse, a code, a glimmer of proof that control or some other lonely soul was out there, listening or speaking back. Each attempt to reach out was met not with the reassurance of human response, but with the haunting persistence of dead frequencies, the spectral remains of communications long since abandoned or consumed by the slow entropy of this place. The more I searched, the more convinced I became that the frequencies themselves had changed, as if the world outside the walls of the station had shifted in my absence, each band now carrying only echoes, repetitions, things that were never meant to be found. At first, my scans revealed nothing but the usual patterns, the rhythmic pulse of the station's backup transponder, the faint oscillation of environmental monitors, the background noise of distant storms. But late one evening, as I cycled through the bands for what felt like the 100th time, my receiver caught something new, a jagged fragment of audio woven into the static, almost too faint to register as real. I leaned in, breath held, coaxing the dials with a care that bordered on reverence. The sound grew clearer, a single, drawn-out syllable, my name, drawn out and twisted by distance and decay. I froze, every muscle tensed, listening as the signal rose and fell in a slow, deliberate pattern, like a hand knocking on a door in the dark. It repeated every few minutes, sometimes just static, sometimes a warped echo of my own voice, reciting fragments of messages I had never sent, or memories I had tried to forget. Compulsively, I began to log every instance, mapping the times and frequencies in the battered notebook that now contained more crossings out and ink smears than legible notes. I tried to decipher patterns in the bursts of sound, running crude spectral analyses on the audio, searching for meaning in the glitches and stutters. Occasionally, I would catch a sequence that felt almost intentional, rising tone, then silence, then a low, pulsing drone that resonated through the station's frame and set my teeth on edge. Sometimes I thought I could hear other voices tangled in the transmission, their words lost in a sea of interference, but always at the core was that same impossible familiarity, the voice that could only have come from me. The recordings piled up, each one more distorted and unreadable than the last, as if the act of documenting the anomaly only made it more elusive, more deeply embedded in the ether. The effect on my mind was corrosive. I began to doubt the evidence of my senses, questioning whether I had truly heard what I thought I heard, or merely conjured it from longing and exhaustion. The station became a maze of feedback loops and delayed echoes, every sound folding back upon itself, every corridor an amplifier for the doubts that stalked me through each waking hour. Even the simplest tasks, logging system statuses, preparing meals, checking the locks, became fraught with the fear that at any moment I would hear the signal again, drawing me back to the comms panel, back to the search for a meaning that would never reveal itself. My dreams, when they came at all, were full of ghostly broadcasts, voices calling to me from within the walls, from beneath the floor, from the frozen wasteland outside. In the waking hours, the lines between inside and outside, between broadcast and hallucination, grew ever more indistinct. I sometimes caught myself speaking aloud to the static, responding to questions that had not been asked, apologizing for things I did not remember doing. The pressure of isolation mounted, pressing down on my thoughts until I was certain the station itself was listening, recording every word and thought, waiting for the right moment to play them back in a new arrangement. There were moments of lucidity, brief flashes where I could convince myself that the signals were nothing more than artifacts, the inevitable product of old equipment and solar storms. But these rationalizations were quickly overwhelmed by the persistence of the transmissions, their uncanny timing, their uncanny knowledge of the things that haunted me most. One night, the Combs array lit up without warning, every indicator flaring to life in a chaos of color and sound. The speakers spat out a torrent of overlapping voices, mine and not mine, calling from a place that was not quite inside the station, not quite outside it either. My name repeated over and over, mingled with fragments of logs I had never written, warnings I had never spoken, memories twisted into new and terrifying shapes. The signal peaked, then died as abruptly as it had begun, plunging the station back into its accustomed quiet. For a long time I sat motionless, unable to decide whether to log the event or erase it from memory altogether, fearing that acknowledgement would give the message power, while denial would only invite its return. Increasingly, I came to believe that the dead frequency was not simply a malfunction or a side effect of the station's decay, but a conduitan opening through which something from the other side, or from some deeper layer of myself, could reach out and touch the world I thought I understood. The boundaries of reality felt increasingly porous, the cold steel of the station no longer a barrier but a membrane, through which voices, thoughts, and fears seeped like fog. The station itself became both transmitter and receiver, each surface humming with the possibility of contact, every cable and circuit a potential pathway for things that had no business traveling through wires. Driven by equal parts terror and curiosity, I set up a continuous recorder on the band where the messages seemed strongest, letting it run day and night while I tried, futilely, to return to my routines. The knock at the hatch faded, replaced by the ever-present whisper of static, the sense that at any moment a new message might come through, bearing news from a world long since lost or a warning meant only for me. The tension was unbearable. Every hour spent waiting was an agony, every false alarm a little death, every genuine transmission a shattering of the thin walls I had built against fear. I found myself staring at the blank monitors, watching for movement in the grain, convinced that any second now the voice would return, clearer and closer than before, calling me to the hatch, to the place where all messages ended and all questions began. It was in this state, suspended between hope and dread, caught in the liminal space between silence and reply, that I began to understand the true horror of the dead frequency. It was not simply that the world outside had gone silent, but that the silence itself had become inhabited, filled with the remnants of those who had waited and listened before me, their voices now woven into the fabric of the noise, calling out across endless miles of frozen earth and dead air. I realized, finally, that I was not alone in my listening, that every survivor, every lost technician, every forgotten soul had left something behind in the static, a trace of longing, a residue of fear, a plea for acknowledgement that could never be answered. And as I sat there, hands pressed to the console, the words of the last message repeating in my mind, I knew with a terrible certainty that whatever was reaching out through the dead frequency would not stop until the hatch was opened, and the silence given form. The logbook was supposed to be my anchor, a chronicle of routine and order, a record that would outlast my own recollections and serve as proof that, whatever happened in this station, someone was here, someone bore witness. Its pages, thick and fibrous, were meant for careful script dates, times, weather reports, system checks, the daily litany of normalcy. But as the days crawled by and my mind grew increasingly porous, what I wrote became only a fraction of what occurred. The words on the page, drifting farther from the truth I was living. I would sit in the chair by the main console, pen in hand, the logbook open to a blank page, and find myself paralyzed by indecision, unable to record the things that truly mattered, unsure if the line between reality and hallucination was one I had crossed or one that had been erased behind me. The first entry I truly remember not writing was nothing more than a sensation and memory of having already recorded the night's events, though the page remained untouched, the pen lying precisely where I had left it hours before. I was certain I had described the sudden spike in the static, the surge of voices on the dead frequency, the way the knock at the hatch had returned with such force that it rattled the bolts in their sockets. Yet when I returned to the logbook, searching for proof, there was nothing, not a single line in my own hand. The memory remained so vivid, so complete, that for a long moment I considered the possibility that the logbook itself had turned against me, erasing my words in the same way the station erased the boundaries between night and day, inside and out, self and other. Over the next several days, this sensation grew more frequent and more disturbing. I would hear the scratch of pen on paper in the quiet hours after midnight, wake to the faint impression of words still hanging in the air. Sometimes I would find the logbook placed at the edge of my bunk, open to a page filled with erratic script, the handwriting unmistakably my own but twisted, the letters elongated and looping as if written by a hand not entirely under my control. These entries always recounted events that I had either tried to forget or could not remember. At Ola knock at the hatch, a message from the dead frequency, a cold presence moving in the corridor, the whisper of my own voice in the vents. The language was fractured, filled with half-finished sentences and desperate pleas, warnings that blurred into apologies, as though the writer had run out of time or strength before the end. I tried to force order upon the chaos. Each morning, I would review the previous day's entries, checking them against my memories, searching for any sign that what I was experiencing was real. But the lines began to shift beneath my eyes. Words changed, sentences rearranged themselves, dates slipped from one page to the next. I began to suspect that the logbook itself had become a kind of transmitter, a vessel for the residue of the station, the voices that lingered in the static and the cold, the fears of all those who had come before me. The further I drifted from the certainty of control, the more the logbook took on a life of its own. It was no longer just a record of my actions, but a mirror for the things I could not bring myself to face, the mistakes, the lapses, the secrets kept even from myself. One entry, written in a hurried scrawl, stood out among the rest. I did not remember writing it, and yet it was written in my own hand. Do not trust the voice. Do not answer the knock. Do not open the hatch, no matter what you hear. The words echoed the last warning from control, yet there was something else in them, a tone of pleading that I recognized as my own only when I was most afraid. I found myself reading this line over and over, as though repetition would lend it new strength, would allow it to overwrite the temptation that grew stronger with each night spent alone with the knock and the voices. Other entries were less clear, fragmented observations about shapes in the darkness, about seeing myself reflected in the glass with my mouth moving, forming words I could not hear. There were notes about the systems failing, the cold creeping in, the feeling of not being alone in the station even when I could account for every sound, every shadow. It became a ritual, this contest between what I remembered and what was recorded. Each evening I would sit with the logbook, pen poised above the page, struggling to commit some new observation to the record. But as I wrote, the words often slipped away, replaced by phrases I did not intend, by warnings and apologies that belonged to someone else, or to some part of myself I could no longer control. Sometimes I would return to a page to find entire paragraphs missing, or a new entry wedged between two previous days, as if the logbook were being kept not just by me, but by every lonely occupant who had ever sat in this chair, listening to the knock and the static and the voice that sounded like their own. The sense of being haunted by myself, by all the selves that came before and would come after, grew almost unbearable. There were moments of clarity, brief respites when I managed to write a true account of the day's event system checks, temperatures, meals, the length of silence between each knock. But even these entries seemed to fade with time, as if the station absorbed them, breaking them down into their constituent fears and feeding them back to me in new and more terrible forms. I began to suspect that the very act of recording my experiences was what summoned the voice, what kept the dead frequency alive, what made the knock return night after night. I wondered if Keller, or any of the others, had felt this same despair, had struggled with the same compulsion to document the undocumentable, to make sense of a reality that was always slipping out of reach. One night, I woke from a feverish dream with the logbook clutched to my chest, its pages damp with sweat. In the dim light, I saw that I had filled page after page with the same message, over and over. It's waiting for you. Don't let it in. The handwriting was wild, almost illegible, the words layered atop one another like the voices in the static, each one more desperate than the last. I tore out the pages, crumpled them in my fists, but the next morning they had returned, neatly pressed back into the logbook as if they had never left. I realized then that the logbook was no longer mine, that it had become a part of the station's endless cycle, a repository for every fear, every warning, every temptation that had ever haunted these halls. In the end, I stopped trying to write altogether. The logbook remained on the console, open to the last entry I remembered making, its pages fluttering in the draft that crept up from the sublevel. Sometimes I would catch a glimpse of a new message scrawled in the margins, a note written in a hand I barely recognized, but I no longer tried to decipher its meaning. The logbook had become both a record and a prophecy, a testament to the futility of order in a world where reality itself had become unreliable. I understood then why so many entries ended abruptly, why so many warnings were left unfinished. There are some things you cannot record, some truths you cannot face, some boundaries you cannot cross without losing yourself entirely. And yet, as the knock returned, as the voice whispered my name through the static, as the dead frequency hummed with new messages, I could not help but wonder if the logbook was the only thing keeping me tethered, the last thin line between myself and the thing waiting on the other side of the hatch. Time had become elastic, a thin thread stretched taut and trembling, fraying at the edges where my memory failed to pin it down. The station's clocks, digital and analog alike, seemed to lose their grip on certainty. I would catch the time stuttering on the main console, the digits blinking out of sync, only to reset when I blinked or looked away. Even my wristwatch, the one thing that should have remained immune to the atmospheric static and the station's slow decay, began to run fast, then slow, then fast again. I started marking time by the rituals that still bound my days, waking, eating, walking the corridors, checking the locks, listening for the voice or the knock or the dead frequency pulsing in the static. But these rituals, too, began to unravel as midnight drew closer each night, the hour when everything seemed to change, when the station's walls seemed too thin and the dark grew deeper, the cold more insistent, the sense of presence overwhelming. Midnight, once just a tick on the clock, took on a significance I could neither articulate nor ignore. It began with small things power fluctuations that always peaked around 23:58, the lights over the hatch corridor flickering in a pulse that matched my racing heart, the static on the comms blossoming into a roar that would just as suddenly cut to silence at the stroke of 12. The knock, when it came, shifted too, its cadence growing slower, heavier, as if the thing on the other side was growing tired or impatient or both. The voice on the frequency became more insistent as the hours crawled toward midnight, pleading with me not just by name but by memory. invoking scenes from my childhood, questions only I could answer, memories I thought I had long since buried. There was a night when, as the minute hand slid toward 12, I heard the voice recite my mother's lullaby, a fragment of melody so specific, so utterly mine, that I nearly ran to the hatch in tears, fists clenched, mouth open to scream. There is a tension that builds in such places, a pressure that seeks release in action, in ritual, in confession. I began to perform small acts of resistance, draping blackout sheets over the comms console, refusing to respond to the voice, clapping my hands to drown out the sound of the knock. But the station seemed to resist my resistance, its power asserting itself in the sudden freezing of the galley pipes at 23:55, the hiss of steam venting through the floor grates, the emergency alarm tripping at random intervals. Each night, as midnight approached, the temperature dropped another degree, the breath hanging thick and heavy in the corridor. Even the logbook, my unreliable confessor, became a weapon against me. I would find entries dated for the following day, as if someone or something had already decided what would happen next. I stopped trying to sleep before midnight. I would sit awake in the control room, every light on, every monitor set to record, pen clutched in a fist gone numb with cold, waiting for the inevitable shift. Sometimes I would play music through the station's battered speakers, hoping the old songs would drown out the whispers that rose in the static as the hour drew near. Other times, I would pace the length of the corridor, counting my steps aloud, matching the rhythm of my heartbeat to the flicker of the overhead fluorescence. Anything to keep from thinking, to keep from listening. But as midnight crept closer, there was no way to shut out the feeling that the station itself was watching, waiting for me to make a choice, to cross a line I could never return from. The sense of countdown became all-consuming. I set alarms on every device I could find, layering the chimes so that there would never be a moment of silence, never a chance for the voice or the knock to slip in unnoticed. But the alarms, like the clocks, betrayed me. They rang at odd hours, sometimes in the middle of the day, sometimes not at all, sometimes all at once, so that the station was filled with a cacophony of shrill beeps and tones, a symphony of confusion that left me dazed and hollow. I unplugged each device, one by one, until I was left with nothing but the old mechanical wall clock in the galley, its hands ticking inexorably toward the moment I feared most. I began to hallucinate in the hours before midnight, flashes of movement in the reflection of the control room window, the sense of eyes watching from the far end of the hatch corridor, the cold touch of a hand on my shoulder when I nodded off at the desk. Sometimes I would see myself standing in the dark, a perfect double with blank eyes and a mouth that moved in time with the static. These visions grew more frequent, more vivid, as midnight drew near, as if the station itself were becoming porous, a membrane through which things from the other side might slip. I started to record myself, hoping to catch the moment when reality changed, to prove that I was still myself when the clocks reset and the knock began again. But each playback was worse than the last, my voice dissolving into a slurry of echoes, the tape filled with hissing and moaning and the unmistakable sound of someone, myself, crying softly in the background. There were nights when the countdown was the only thing that mattered, when I sat on the floor outside the hatch, knees pulled to my chest, watching the minutes bleed away, feeling the pulse of the thing beyond the door matching the rhythm of my own panic. Midnight would come, and with it a silence so deep it felt like the end of the world, a silence broken only by the slow, deliberate knock and the voice that had become my shadow, my reflection, my enemy. "Let me in," it would plead, again and again, and sometimes I thought I could hear another voice behind it, fainter, more desperate, as if someone else was trapped on the other side of the hatch, counting down to their own midnight. The sense of inevitability grew heavier with each passing day. The station, the voice, the knock, the countdown, all of it seemed orchestrated to drive me toward the hatch, to make me believe that the only escape from this place was to open the door and face whatever waited in the dark. I resisted as best I could, clinging to the rituals that had once kept me safe. But the force pulling me toward the hatch grew stronger with every midnight, every moment when the clocks blinked 0 o'clock and the world seemed to reset itself around me. I wondered if this was how Keller had felt, how all those before me had fought and failed, how the station consumed each of us in turn, leaving nothing behind but warnings in the logbook and voices in the static. As another midnight approached, I found myself standing in the corridor, the hatch looming before me, my hand reaching out almost of its own accord. The voice was louder now, closer, its pleas mingling with threats, promises, memories. I stared at the seal, tracing the letters etched into the steel, feeling the cold radiate through my skin, and I understood at last that the countdown was not to an hour, but to a decision. Not to midnight, but to the moment when I would choose whether to obey the warnings of the past or to give in to the hope desperate, poisonous, that there was something on the other side of the hatch worth risking everything for. Midnight was coming, and with it the end of all excuses, all denials, all illusions of control. The countdown had begun, and I was powerless to stop it, powerless to do anything but listen, wait, and hope that when the hour struck, I would have the strength to choose what came next. The world outside the station had always been a blankness, a depthless expanse of night and snow, so absolute in its silence that anything beyond the frost-furred glass became a thing of imagination, a landscape shaped by absence as much as reality. I had grown used to looking out at nothing, the same muted colors, the same indistinct horizon, the certainty that whatever threats existed would be held at bay by the cold and the metal walls. But as midnight came and went, and the rituals of the countdown yielded only exhaustion and a hollow, echoing relief, I began to see things in the dark. At first it was just a suggestion, an ambiguous movement in the periphery of my vision, a brief shiver in the thin moonlight slanting across the frost. I told myself it was only my mind, worn down by isolation and repetition, conjuring shadows where there were none. Yet the impressions grew more persistent. There would be a flicker at the edge of the security feed, a smudge on the glass that resolved itself, if only for a heartbeat, into a silhouette that did not belong to any piece of machinery or drift of snow. I started to keep vigil by the windows, pressing my forehead to the icy pane, breath fogging the surface until my reflection loomed like a stranger. Outside, the darkness was complete, interrupted only by the anemic glow from the station's emergency lights. Sometimes I would convince myself that the movement was nothing more than the wind shifting a sheet of ice, or the station's own shadow stretching under the thin lunar light. But there were nights when the shapes would linger, clustered at the edge of the floodlights, outlines tall and narrow, wavering in a manner no weather could explain. They gathered at odd angles, leaning into the light as if testing its strength, withdrawing whenever I reached for a flashlight or banged a fist on the glass. I tried to film them, but the images on playback were always corrupted lines of static where the shapes should be, colors bleeding together, frames lost in digital blur. Only the sense of movement remained, recorded in the sick, accelerating rhythm of my heart and the dampness of my palms as I gripped the windowsill. One evening, as the station's lights flickered and the temperature plunged with unnatural abruptness, I saw a shadow move with deliberate purpose across the snow. It halted, for a moment, directly in the path of the main floodlight, too distant to resolve any features, but too defined to be a trick of atmosphere. I watched, motionless, as it extended a thin arm, reaching toward the hatch as if it could sense me watching. as if it recognized the impossibility of its presence and reveled in the tension it created. The knock came a moment later, heavy and slow, as if the shadow had called it forth, the sound vibrating through the walls and up through my feet. I recoiled from the glass, stumbling back into the safety of the corridor, every nerve burning with cold and terror. I tried to radio control out of habit, but the Comes array responded only with the low, insistent pulse of the dead frequency. My own voice warped and delayed, returning to me in fragments. Don't look, don't listen, don't answer. After that night, the shadows grew bolder, drawing closer to the station's perimeter, hovering just beyond the reach of the floodlights. Sometimes they pressed themselves flat against the walls, their forms distorted by the curve of the metal, appearing taller or wider or more angular with every passing hour. I developed a compulsion to walk the inside of the station in darkness, trying to surprise the watchers, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever waited out there. Each time I approached a window, I found myself holding my breath, counting the beats between the flickers of movement, the stretch of shadow, the fleeting glint of what might have been eyes watching from the snow. More than once, I thought I saw a phaser pale smear in the dark, lips stretched into a grin, eyes black and bottomless, wide with anticipation. I started to hear new sounds in the corridor, footsteps that were not mine, a soft tap against the metal from outside, the shuffle of something dragging itself across the frost. Doors that had always been difficult to open now seemed to resist my touch, the handles turning stiff and reluctant, as if trying to hold back the pressure of whatever pressed against them. The emergency lights flickered in sequence, strobing through the station and casting wild, distorted shadows on every wall, shadows that did not always match my own movements. Once, as I passed the hatch, I caught my reflection in the thick glass and saw something standing behind me, so close I could feel its breath on my neck. I spun around, fists raised, but found only empty air and the low, ceaseless hum of the generator struggling against the cold. The nights became a contest between vigilance and fatigue. I would sit for hours in the control room, monitors arrayed before me, each one tuned to a different angle of the exterior, each feed washed in a haze of static and digital noise. The shadows would appear and vanish, always in motion, always on the verge of coherence, always withdrawing when I tried to focus on them. Sometimes the knock would coincide with a sudden surge of movement figures gliding across the snow, gathering in clusters, merging and splitting like liquid darkness, impossible to count or track. I began to suspect that they were not alone, that their numbers grew with each night, that every shadow contained another, deeper shadow, nested within it like a secret waiting to be revealed. One night, desperate for proof that I was not imagining everything, I rigged the floodlights to their highest setting and aimed them directly at the ground outside the hatch. The world beyond the glass blazed white, every contour of the snow etched in perfect detail, every flaw and ripple of the ground laid bare. For a few precious seconds, I saw nothing but emptiness, no movement, no shadows, no signs of life. Relief surged through me, wild and fleeting. But then, as the bulbs began to hum and crackle, their filaments burning too hot, I saw the snow begin to sink and shiver, as if something vast and formless was moving beneath the surface, following the path of the cables, the pressure pipes, the foundation itself. I watched, paralyzed, as an arm broke the surface, pale and thin, fingers splayed and searching, groping blindly for the hatch. The lights died in a shower of sparks, plunging the world back into darkness. I collapsed against the glass, breath fogging in wild bursts, my body racked with trembling. In the silence that followed, the knock began again, slower and heavier than ever before, each blow measured and deliberate, each one announcing the presence of a thing that would not be denied. The voice returned, thick with longing and resentment, its cadence so perfectly matched to my own that I no longer trusted the sound of my thoughts. Let me in, let me in. You know me, you've always known me. The glass itself seemed to thrum with the pressure of that voice, the words vibrating through the metal and the air, infiltrating the marrow of my bones. I began to dread the dawn, knowing that every sunrise would bring new shadows, new movements in the snow, new warnings scrawled in the margins of the logbook. The boundaries between inside and outside, between watcher and watched, between shadow and self, were breaking down. Sometimes I wondered if the thing outside had always been there, waiting for someone to look long enough, to listen hard enough, to open the hatch and let it in. Sometimes, in the depths of exhaustion and fear, I wondered if I was the shadow, if I had always been the thing pressing against the glass, longing for entry, desperate for recognition. The days and nights dissolved into one long vigil. The only certainty, the slow, insistent approach of the thing beyond the station's walls, and the knowledge that sooner or later the glass would not be enough to keep it out. It's a strange truth that the places you are told to forget, the locked doors and shuttered passages meant to be omitted from daily routine, are the ones that begin to dominate your thoughts when everything else is failing. The lower tunnel beneath the station was one of these forbidden places, a legacy from the first phase of construction, a redundancy that had since been written out of the official blueprints, replaced by blank space and a single line in the protocol binder: sublevel access sealed, maintenance forbidden, hatch must remain locked at all times. For weeks, this prohibition had been a comfort, a boundary beyond which the logic of the station still held firm. I accepted that whatever waited behind the heavy hatch was not my responsibility, that it belonged to the realm of myth and malfunction, a story to explain the knocks and the shifting cold, a precaution with roots lost to time. But as the days stretched and the nights grew longer and the shadows at the window multiplied, I found myself drawn inexorably to that part of the station, compelled not by curiosity but by a sense of inevitability, as if every strange occurrence, every whisper in the static, every new message in the logbook, every cold spot and power surge were part of an elaborate choreography designed to guide me downward. My first venture toward the sublevel was born of necessity, or so I told myself. The generator's behavior had become erratic, its coughing stutters and abrupt silences increasing in frequency until I could no longer trust the emergency lighting to hold through the night. I was certain the fault lay in the wiring beneath the floor, the oldest part of the system, a place no one had checked in years. The path to the hatch felt different at night, colder, the condensation in the air thicker, beads of water tracing slow lines down the steel like sweat on a fevered brow. Each step echoed, unnaturally loud, a sharp report that reverberated back in a way I did not remember from before, as if the tunnel itself were amplifying my presence, announcing my approach to whatever might be waiting below. I carried every tool I could think of: a flashlight, a voltmeter, a length of cord, a crowbar that felt heavier with every step. My heart pounded, not with anticipation, but with the sick certainty that the rules of the station had changed, that the order which once governed this place had dissolved into something far more arbitrary. I paused at the hatch, breathing through clenched teeth, feeling the cold radiate through the metal. The lock was, as I remembered, heavy, mechanical, a design so antiquated that it resisted my every attempt at subtlety. I traced my fingers over the etched serial numbers, the chipped paint, the places where hands before mine had left their own story in scratches and wear. The temptation to open the hatch, to break the last taboo, was stronger than ever, but so was the warning that hummed in my veins. Do not trust the voice, do not answer the knock, do not open the hatch. I set down my tools, shined the flashlight through the narrow viewport, and saw only darkness. The glass was fogged from the inside, impossible to clear. For a long moment, I stood, undecided, feeling the pull of the unknown below and the brittle comfort of protocol at my back. The generator's cough grew louder, echoing up from beneath the floor, and I made my decision. I would not open the hatch, not yet. Instead, I resolved to check the auxiliary wiring from the access panel in the galley, hoping to find some rational cause for the power failures. Some proof that the ghosts of the sublevel were nothing more than a circuit in need of repair. I spent hours tracing cables through crawl spaces, so tight I bruised my ribs, mapping the ancient wiring against a blueprint that never matched reality. Each time I tapped into a line, the lights above would flicker, the air would grow colder, and the static on the comms would spike, a jagged peak that sent shivers down my spine. More than once, I thought I heard voices from the vents, words stretched and mangled by distance and distortion, calling me downward in tones that mirrored my own voice, pleading for help, promising answers. That night, I dreamed of the tunnels, though I had never seen them. In the dream, I moved through darkness so complete it erased the boundaries of my own body. My senses reduced to the scrape of boots on concrete and the echo of my breath rebounding from damp, unseen walls. There were doors in the dark, each one marked with warnings in a language I could not read, and behind every door a pair of eyes watching, unblinking, waiting for me to approach. I woke in a panic, tangled in my blanket, the logbook open to a page I did not remember writing. It's coming from below. Don't go down, it isn't empty. The handwriting was my own, jagged and urgent, the ink smeared as if written in haste or fear. The next day, the cold grew worse, spreading from the hatch throughout the station, crawling up through the floor and into the walls, settling in my bones. The knock at the hatch grew more insistent, joined by a second, then a third, a chorus of demands echoing up from the darkness. The voice in the static changed, its cadence sharper, more insistent, layering questions with threats, promises with accusations. Why are you afraid? You've always known what's down here. Let us in. The boundaries of the station shifted, the familiar corridors warping in my mind, the doors and panels seeming to move of their own accord, guiding me, always, back to the hatch. I tried to resist, tried to focus on the rituals that had kept me sane, logging, walking, counting, but the pull was inexorable, a gravity that bent every thought, every movement, toward the forbidden place. It was in this state of dread and exhaustion that I began to notice other changes, faint markings on the floor leading to the hatch. Tracks too regular to be my own, as if something heavy had been dragged from the corridor into the dark. The air near the hatch tasted different, sharp and metallic, tinged with the scent of ozone and old blood. The flashlight would flicker whenever I approached, its beam refracting in ways that made shadows seem to crawl along the walls, retreating into cracks and corners just beyond reach. Sometimes I would hear movement from below, a scraping, a shuffling, the sound of something large shifting in the gloom. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just the old stories reasserting themselves in my tired mind, but I could not shake the certainty that the sublevel was no longer empty, if it ever had been. The comms array captured new voices, snippets of conversation that made no sense, phrases spoken in my own accent but twisted, layered atop one another until meaning dissolved into noise. The logbook filled with warnings, most written in my hand, but some in scripts I did not recognize, messages that seemed to bleed up from the pages rather than down from my pen. I began to see reflections in the glass that were not mine, faces, staring up from the darkness, eyes wide with fear or hunger or both, lips moving in silent warning. The cold grew deeper, the knock louder, the boundaries between, above and below, inside and outside, sanity and madness, thinning with every passing hour. One night, as midnight drew near, I found myself standing before the hatch once more, the cold so intense it burned. I pressed my hand against the metal and felt it vibrate, a deep, slow pulse that matched the rhythm of the knock, matched the cadence of the voice in the static. In that moment, I understood that the tunnels below were never truly empty, that they were a reservoir for every fear, every secret, every forbidden thought the station had ever contained. I stepped back, trembling, unwilling to open the hatch, unwilling to turn away, caught between the promise of answers and the certainty of doom. The tunnel waited, patient and hungry, and I knew that as long as I remained in the station, it would never let me go, never allow me to forget what was hidden in the dark below, never let me pretend that the emptiness was anything but a lie. The thing about echoes is that they don't belong only to sound. They belong to space, to memory, to the persistent ghost of an action someone else took long ago and never lived to regret properly. I began hearing them, not just in the static, not just in the crackling repetitions of my own voice bouncing back at me through broken channels, but in the bones of the station itself. They resonated through the metal when I walked the corridor, through the floor beneath the galley, in the faint tremors that shook the pipes in the control room, even when the wind outside was still. The station had started to remember things, not through data or sensors or logs, but through sensation patterns baked into its frame by repetition, by trauma, by the cycle of men and women who had stood where I stood, alone, cold, desperate, trying to follow rules that had been written by people who had never seen the shadows moving behind the glass or heard a voice that sounded like their own begging to be let in. The ones who didn't listen had names once, I'm sure: Keller, Michaela Ver, Singh. The files on them had been brief, sterile, and dispassionate. A line of text indicating their exit date. A single comment on their deterioration or emotional fatigue or, in the case of one, abnormal behavior during final week recommend full debrief. But there had never been a debrief. Just rotation logs and empty bunk tags and stations that didn't speak of what they had witnessed. Their presence became clearer after I found the second logbook. It was tucked behind the maintenance panel above the old water filtration unit, sealed in a plastic sleeve now yellowed with age. Its cover was identical to mine, same markings, same stamped code. But the name scratched onto the inside flap was a different one: Corporal Elias Vaan. I had never read the name before. There was no record of him in the assignment logs, no note in the command database, nothing in the old terminal backups. But the logbook was real, and what was inside it turned the station's quiet into something else entirely. The entries started off like mine routine checks, weather observations, fuel readings. Then, about 3 weeks in, the entries took a shift. Knock at 2:17, dismissed as structural, but duration was too rhythmic. 2 days later, heard my own voice through channel 3 be no open transmission at time. 4 days after that, saw movement beyond hatch. Not a shadow. It was watching me. The handwriting grew, slanted, rushed, and near the end, nearly illegible. Final entry, a scrawl, barely coherent, opened the hatch. Not empty, not alone, too late now. Nothing after that. I stared at the last line for a long time. My hands trembled as I closed the book, its weight heavier than paper and ink. I replaced it where I found it and sat in the control room in silence. No lights, no heating, just the low murmur of the static and the hum of my own blood in my ears. The echoes had a shape now. They had a name. They had steps that could be retraced, curious at first, then unnerved, then isolated, then finally convinced that they had no other option but to know, to open the hatch and face whatever waited on the other side. I didn't sleep that night. I stared at the wall, half expecting Varn to step out of the corridor, pale and frostbitten, lips peeled back to whisper what had become of him. But no one came, only the knock. The next few days were worse. I started hearing new voices, layered in the static. Some whispering, others screaming. Some speaking in a language that might have once been English, but now bent into shapes that didn't belong in the human mouth. One voice repeated the same phrase over and over, "You're not the first." Another would weep, inconsolable, whispering it wasn't supposed to be me. I heard laughter once, low and mirthless, so close to my ear that I ripped the headset off and flung it across the room, where it broke against the panel. I could not tell if these were transmissions or hallucinations. It didn't matter anymore. I'd crossed a threshold, and the station knew it. The echoes grew bolder. My own footsteps would continue half a beat after I stopped walking. I'd turn corners and hear doors hiss closed behind me when I knew they'd been sealed. One night, walking through the maintenance corridor, I saw my own figure pass the windowed junction ahead of me. Not a reflection, not a trick of the light me. Walking, looking straight ahead, wearing the same clothes I wore that day, but older, hollowed, as if I'd already opened the hatch and come back changed. There was a new pattern in the knocks, not random anymore, not slow and heavy like before. Now they came in threes, followed by silence, then 2 short bursts, a pause, then 5. 3 minus, 2 minus 5. It repeated nightly, as if rehearsed. I wrote it down out of reflex, then realized the significance a moment later. That had been Varn's ID code, the same number stamped into the corner of the logbook I found. That was when I stopped pretending this place was governed by physics, or cold, or wiring, or weather. It was governed by memory. It was governed by the accumulation of everyone who had come here and failed to leave whole. I tried sealing the corridor to the hatch, blocking it off with crates and metal braces, but they'd be moved by morning. Not violently, just subtly misaligned, as if someone had gently pushed them aside and waited for me to notice. I tore the fuse from the corridor lighting and turned the cameras away from that hall, but the feed still showed it, grainy and grey, and every few hours the image would flicker and reveal someone standing in front of the hatch, never moving, never speaking, never turning around, just waiting. Eventually, I gave up pretending that these echoes weren't intelligent. They remembered, and they adapted. They knew how to get close without alarming me, how to use silence as a weapon. Some nights, there would be no knock, no voice, no shadow, just stillness. That was worse. It let me believe it was over, just long enough for me to lower my guard. Then it would return, louder, deeper, more invasive, the knock shaking the station down to its supports. I began to dream of them, not just the shadows, but the people who came before me, Varn, Keller, others I didn't know. We would stand in the sublevel together, surrounded by that wet, mechanical smell of rust and blood and oil. Each one with a hand on the hatch, each whispering to the next that it was time to open it. And in the dream, I never resisted. None of us did. I started marking the days on the wall with a blade from the toolkit, not trusting the clocks anymore. I passed 37 marks, then 38, then woke to find all of them scrubbed away, the wall spotless. I started over. They vanished again. I realized the station didn't want me to know how long I'd been here, that it fed on unmoored time. I taped up photographs from the personnel files, faces of the former crew members long gone, hoping that staring at them would anchor me. But even they began to change us, scratched out, smiles reversed, names smeared into nothing. I know now the echoes are not just memories, they're invitations. They whisper in voices you trust, show you visions that feel like recollections, twist your own identity into something malleable. They strip away the armor of language and protocol and science until all that's left is instinct and fear. They don't just want you to open the hatch. They want you to believe it was your idea, that it was always inevitable, that all those who came before you didn't make a mistake, they fulfilled a purpose, and that you, too, must fulfill it. Tonight the hatch is louder than ever. The voice is weeping again, calling me by name, describing memories from my childhood that no one should know. I've turned off the power. There's no light in the station now, except the glow from the monitor in front of me, where the corridor feed plays on a loop. I see the shape standing by the hatch, motionless. I think it's wearing my face. I don't know what I'll do when the next knock comes. I'm no longer sure whose thoughts are in my head, or whose hand is writing these words. All I know is that the echoes are close now, closer than they've ever been, and that they are no longer satisfied with being heard. There's a moment in every transmission where the silence carries more weight than the signal, a pause so full it becomes the message itself. That's what the station had become now, one endless pause, heavy with something that was no longer waiting to be heard but waiting to be acknowledged. I stopped pretending I could still chart the difference between what came from outside and what was rising up from inside me, because somewhere in the static and the broken hours and the echoes of footsteps that no longer belonged to me, it had begun to speak with my voice. Not just mimicry, not just a recording played back on a dying frequency. It had learned the rhythm of my sentences, the way my breath caught when I lied to myself, the precise intonation I used when I whispered the words I couldn't admit aloud. And then it began using them against me. At first it was subtle, a recorded log I didn't remember making, playing back in my own voice late at night, describing events that hadn't happened yet, warnings that seemed nonsensical until hours later, when they unfolded exactly as spoken. A whispered phrase caught on the wind in the vent shaft, so soft I thought I was imagining it until I heard it again in the cold corridor by the galley, my name, drawn out with the faintest trace of something like affection. And then came the messages scrawled into the corners of the logbook, written in my hand but not by me, messages that sounded like confessions from someone who had long since surrendered. You know what it wants. You've always known. Let it in. There was no mistaking it now. It wasn't just speaking to me. It was speaking as me. It had begun to enter my dreams, not as an entity, but as a presence beneath my own skin. In those hours when sleep was more necessity than rest, I found myself standing before the hatch again and again, hand outstretched, fingers grazing the seal, the voice behind it crooning my name like a forgotten lullaby. I saw myself opening the door, not in terror, but in calm resignation, as if I had always intended to. The dreams always ended the same way, darkness rushing in like smoke, followed by the sensation of falling, not down, but inward, collapsing into a version of myself I no longer recognized. I would wake up gasping, drenched in sweat despite the cold, the name still echoing in my ears, the cadence of my own voice spoken by something not entirely human. I tried to isolate the signal, built crude filters into the comms system to trap only external interference, but it was pointless. Every channel eventually bled the same voice, the same repetition of name and memory and demand. The voice began using details it shouldn't have known, the color of my childhood room, the exact phrasing of a letter I'd written to someone I'd loved and lost, the lull in my voice when I spoke to my brother the last time we saw each other. I stopped trying to argue with the voice. I stopped trying to block it out. There's a kind of intimacy in being known so completely that even your secrets feel communal, a sense that someone, something, has been watching from the inside all along. The knock changed to it, no longer came at random intervals, no longer served as the announcement of something distant. It became a kind of punctuation, an emphasis after the voice spoke my name, a metronome that measured my weakening resistance. I sat for hours just listening to the rhythm, letting it sink into me, knowing that each knock was not just a demand but a declaration. It knows who you are. It knows what you fear. It knows the exact moment you will give in. The shadows became bolder. I saw them not just through the windows or in the camera feeds, but in reflections that moved when I did not, in corridors where no light should have cast any shape at all. I would pass the mirrored panel in the airlock and see my own face stare back at me with a delay just long enough to confirm it wasn't mine. It smiled. Sometimes it mouthed something silently, and I didn't need to hear the words to know what it was saying. You're almost ready. I stopped using mirrors. I stopped trusting the cameras. I took to walking the station in complete darkness, thinking if I could deny it a surface to reflect from, it might forget what I looked like. But the voice didn't need mirrors. It was in the wiring now, in the steel, in the seams of the floor beneath my feet. It no longer waited for midnight. It spoke to me constantly, a soft murmur beneath the hum of the lights, beneath the ticking of the emergency power relay. Sometimes I didn't notice until I stopped moving and realized that the words hadn't come from my own thoughts. Sometimes I did notice and responded anyway. The final breach came when I found the file, hidden deep within the oldest sector of the system, encrypted in a language I barely remembered from training. It was labeled only as RET, Protocol Authorized Eyes Only. Inside were fragments of logs from other stations' outposts in the same network, all marked as decommissioned, all lost under obscure justifications. But the patterns were there. In every one, an operator reported the same signs: dead frequencies, returning noise that resembled human speech, failures in the comm systems, increased cold and power loss, hallucinations involving mirrors, messages appearing in logbooks, voices speaking in the operator's own tone, and always, at the end, a final entry referencing a name being spoken by something outside, followed by silence. The last line of the file was not a report. It was a question typed with shaking hands. Why does it always know our names? I couldn't answer. I don't know how it knew mine. I don't know what part of me it had touched, or studied, or claimed. But I did know that it was growing bolder, more certain, more patient. It didn't want to destroy me. It wanted to be let in. And it knew that the easiest way to gain entry wasn't through terror or violence. It was through recognition, through making me feel that it had always been there, always waiting, always whispering, just out of reach. The knock is less frequent now. The voice doesn't plead. It converses. It tells me stories I had forgotten. It compliments my clarity, tells me I've been brave. It doesn't rush. It waits. Because it knows something I'm only just starting to accept. That the real hatch isn't the one sealed in metal and bolted shut at the end of the corridor. It's the one inside me. The door built of memory and fear and all the things I've locked away, thinking that isolation would keep them quiet, but they have found their way back. And when I hear the voice speak my name again, soft and assured and so perfectly, horribly mine, I don't flinch. I listen, because part of me wants to answer. Part of me already has. There is a moment, thin and glistening like the edge of a razor, when you stop believing that something will happen and begin knowing it already is. That was how I felt the first time I heard the lock on the hatch shift without my hand on it. It wasn't dramatic, not a groaning of hinges or a clattering of bolts, but a click, soft and decisive, the kind of sound that travels through metal with purpose. I was in the galley at the time, counting out the remaining ration packs, not because I needed to eat, but because it was something with numbers and borders and certainty. And then I heard it so faint I nearly dismissed it until I realized what it meant. The seal on the lower hatch, the one I had been told never to approach, The one I had watched for weeks as it trembled with unspoken demand had begun to shift, alone, deliberately, as if something on the other side had tired of waiting and decided that my resistance was no longer relevant. I didn't run. That's the part that haunts me. I didn't even stand up. I just sat there, one hand frozen over a vacuum-sealed pack of protein paste, head tilted toward the corridor, heart beginning to pulse with a rhythm not entirely my own. The air in the station thickened, not colder, not warmer, just denser, heavier, like the weight of water pressing down above a diver's skull. I told myself I would go check it. I told myself it was a systems glitch, a pressure release, a settling of old hardware. But I didn't move until the knock came again, softer this time, closer to a tap, like fingers brushing the metal with familiarity, with affection. And then the voice, low and intimate, almost a whisper. You left it open. I'm coming in. When I reached the corridor, the lights had dimmed of their own accord, their flickering no longer random, but in sync with the soft pulse I now felt beneath my feet, a vibration in the steel grating that climbed through my boots and up my spine. The hatch itself looked unchanged, but I could see the line of frost around its edges had begun to melt, thin veins of condensation bleeding out like fingers reaching for the rest of the station. I approached slowly, each step echoing too loudly, and noticed the lock indicator, a red LED that had never once blinked, was pulsing green, not fully lit, just enough to let me know it wasn't locked anymore, just enough to let me know something had changed. I didn't touch it. I couldn't. I just stood there, close enough to hear the faintest mechanical shift every few seconds, like tumblers slowly falling into place. That night I didn't sleep. I couldn't trust the hatch to remain closed. I set up what crude surveillance gear I could muster, looping the corridor feed to an auxiliary monitor, setting motion alarms on the floor grid, even jamming a steel support beam across the handle, knowing full well that none of it would matter. The station had made up its mind, and what frightened me more than anything was that part of me had to. There was no longer a binary choice, no longer a line between open and shut. The hatch wasn't a door anymore. It was a boundary, dissolving. The voice returned more frequently, and now it no longer needed the comms system. It came through the vents, through the vibration of the wall panels, through the thrum of the backup generator when it groaned to life in the early hours of the morning. It was always my name, always in my own voice, but shifted slightly, like a song played at the wrong speed. And it began to speak, not of the past, but of what came next. We'll be one again, it said once, just as I was dozing off at the console. You left something down here. Let me give it back. Other times it would murmur instructions, absurd at first burn, the logbook. Break the mirror in the sleeping quarters, fill the sink with water and stare into it until you see. I obeyed none of them, not at first, but they wore me down, not by force, but through inevitability, because every time I disobeyed, something else shifted, a new anomaly in the system, a new shadow in the corridor, another soft click from the hatch. And the worst part was that the hatch began to respond to me without my input. I'd walk past, not even thinking about it, and the lock light would flicker. I'd be standing at the far end of the station and hear the mechanism cycle. Once I returned from a maintenance sweep and found the hatch agile by less than an inch, just enough to see the blackness beyond, just enough to confirm that the frost inside had turned to rivulets of water running inward, not outward. I pushed it shut without looking in. I didn't want to know what was on the other side, not yet, but I knew it had seen me. By the third week, my perception of the station shifted entirely. It no longer felt like a structure. It felt like an organism. The walls breathed. The lights blinked in sequence like eyes. The silence between sounds grew shorter, as if the station itself had run out of patience for its own haunted stillness. And the hatch became its mouth, parting slowly with every cycle, never fully open, never quite closed. There were nights I would dream I had opened it, walked down into the Sublerville, and found not a chamber, but a mirror, and that in the mirror I was not myself, but the voice, and I was speaking to someone else, still up above, still resisting, still afraid, and then I'd wake up and the hatch would be fogged with breath from the inside. I tried recording everything, audio, video, sensor data, but the files always corrupted. Sometimes they'd play back at 10 times speed, sometimes backward. Sometimes the audio would be replaced with my own voice reading things I'd never written. "You'll feel better once it's done," I once heard myself say on a corrupted feed, though I hadn't spoken that day at all. I stopped trusting the logs. I stopped trusting the timestamps. I began to realize the station wasn't merely haunted by voices. It had memory, it had agency, and it had plans for me. The voice began to laugh. Not often, not cruelly, just softly, like a parent humoring a child who still believes in hiding. "You've come so far," it said one night as I sat trembling in the dark. "Do you remember when you said you'd never speak to me?" Then silence. Then the sound of my own voice laughing back, as though it were disappointed but amused. And then, finally, it said, "You've already let me in. You just haven't realized where the hatch really is." That was when I looked at my hand and realized it was wet. Not sweat, not blood. Just a clear, viscous fluid I couldn't identify, clinging to my palm like condensation from the inside of the glass. I backed away from the console and felt the cold again, not from the air, but from something internal. A frost that had begun somewhere beneath the skin and was slowly working its way outward. I looked toward the corridor, toward the hatch I no longer needed to check, because I knew it was open now, not physically, but metaphysically, a passage not into a place, but into something I had already allowed into me. The voice didn't need to knock anymore. The station didn't need to whisper. I had answered, not with a key or a code or a breach of protocol. I had answered the moment I listened, the moment I believed. Now I sit here, not to warn you, not to plead, but because the final lock is clicking into place, and I am no longer afraid. The hatch opens. The hatch is opening. The hatch has always been open. You just hadn't noticed. But you will, you will, you will. There is a difference between knowing and accepting, between fearing something and inviting it in. The hatch had opened whether with steel hinges or through the slow corrosion of will. It no longer mattered on what had once been a boundary I resisted, became instead a wound I could not stop touching. Every part of the station reflected this change. The air no longer tasted of recycled sterility, but of damp stone and decay, as though some long-buried chamber had been exposed and allowed to breathe again. Condensation streaked the walls like tears, and the lights, when they remained lit, cast shadows that fell against geometry in ways that made no sense. Corners stretched, angles curved inward, spaces once familiar now seemed smaller or larger depending on the direction I turned. Sometimes I would walk the corridor toward the control room and find myself arriving instead at the sleeping quarters, having passed no doors, no intersections, just a feeling of misplacement, as though the architecture had changed around me without sound or warning. The voice no longer pretended to be separate from me. It narrated my movements in real time, not aloud, but within, as if my own thoughts were being sublet to something older and amused by my denial. When I looked at the comms array, it whispered the codes before I typed them. When I reached for the logbook, it dictated the entries, sometimes ahead of my hand, sometimes in languages I didn't speak but could understand. One morning, I woke up at the console, unaware of how I got there, and found that I had written 37 pages in a language composed of spirals and glyphs. Yet I remembered every sentence. The words did not tell a story. They were a design, not instruction, not confession, just structure, like the blueprints of something that wanted to be built inside me. The knock stopped. I didn't notice at first, but after 2 days, the absence became louder than the sound itself. The silence pressed against me from all sides, expanding in the spaces between seconds. It wasn't a silence of stillness. It was a held breath, waiting to be exhaled. I tried to fill it with noise music from the old backups, emergency alerts. Even the hiss of static turned up so loud the speakers buzzed with distortion, but it was like throwing sand into a black hole. The station absorbed it, smothered it, returned only its own subtle sounds, a creak where there should be no movement, a dripping from walls that contained no pipes, the soft crunch of snow beneath non-existent boots. The silence had depth now, a bottomless quality. It wasn't passive. It was watching, measuring the time between my acknowledgements, waiting for something I had already done to finish being realized. I tried to leave a message for control, not because I thought it would reach them by now. I knew that channel was long dead, but because some old ritual in me demanded it. The voice, patient and unmocking, allowed it. I recorded an audio log, clear and concise, described the hatch, described the changes, described how I could feel my thoughts rewriting themselves mid-formation. Then I tried to play it back. There was no voice on the recording, just silence for 21 minutes, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone walking slowly up metal stairs, breathing in a rhythm that did not belong to me, ending with the sound of a door opening and a sigh so long and intimate it made my skin crawl. That night I dreamed I was not in the station at all. I dreamed I was back on the helicopter before the assignment began. Wind screaming past the rotors, the co-pilot shouting something I couldn't make out. The pilot turned to look at me. It was me, my face, but blank, stretched, the eyes wrong. The mouth moved, but didn't speak, just grinned. Then the glass cracked and the world tilted and I fell upward through miles of screaming light until I landed back at the hatch, which was now open, not into a corridor, but into a mirror of the station, identical in every way except for the fact that it pulsed, as if breathing, and every light cast not illumination, but shadow. I woke up, choking on my own breath, hand outstretched toward nothing, fingers curled as if I'd been holding someone else's hand. When I returned to the hatch, the corridor was wrong, longer than before. The light at the far end no longer flickered, it throbbed. I walked the length of it without recalling the first few steps. The hatch stood open now, fully, unapologetically, and beyond it was darkness, not pitch black, not void, but a layered dark, textured, alive. I could hear movement within it, not mechanical or wet or monstrous, but precise and soft and human. The air beyond the threshold did not flow into the station. Instead, the station's atmosphere seemed to flow out, pulled gently into whatever space lay beyond. The steel walls had a slickness to them now, like skin, and inside the dark, something breathed. I stepped back, only once. The voice responded immediately. "There's nothing left to close," it said. "This was always your room. You just forgot how it was shaped." My mind, usually fractured with panic or calculation or narrative, simply accepted this. I was not afraid, not in the way I had been. The fear had transformed into something slower, heavier, a kind of nostalgia for the self I had been before. I'd allowed the knock to become familiar. I sat outside the hatch for a long time, thinking not about whether I would enter, but how long I had already been inside without realizing it. I went through the station one last time, cataloguing not the systems, but the sounds. The gentle pop of air through the vent that had begun to hum in time with my breathing. The soft clicks behind the walls, where nothing mechanical remained. The scrape of something being dragged along the far end of the ceiling, where there were no crawl spaces. I stopped in front of each mirror and stared into it. My reflection no longer lagged. It now moved first. I saluted myself in the main hall. The reflection blinked twice, then grinned before I could. I laughed. I had begun to see the shape of it now. The logic, the memory, the trap. It wasn't just the station that held me here. It was everything I had ever refused to name. Everything I had buried. Everything I had ignored. Final warning. That's what they'd called the last transmission in the old debrief notes. The one just before the technician went silent. The one that always ended the same way. I found the entry again on a damaged drive, decoded the message embedded in the signal, layered in 10 bands of interference. Just for words, whispered by the voice of someone trying not to cry. It already knew me, and now it knows me too. Not as a stranger, not as a threat, as something it once was, or still is, or will become again. I leave this message not for rescue, not for warning, but because ritual demands a final word. I do not expect it to transmit. I do not expect it to remain after I'm gone. I expect only that the station will continue, as it always has, as it always must, waiting for another name, another voice, another hatch. And when it finds one, it will do what it did to me: wait, whisper, listen, and unlock. I go now, not as a prisoner, not as a sacrifice. I go home. This recorder is running, not because I expect rescue, and certainly not because I believe that anything I say now will matter to the outside world, if there even is such a thing anymore. It's running because it's the only thing left that hasn't turned against me. The walls have eyes, and the wiring has learned how to breathe, and the voice has taken on the quality of memory, of bloodline, of inheritance. But this recorder, this thin worry, half-cracked black box is still just a machine. Or maybe it isn't, and I've simply made peace with the fact that, even if it's listening to, at least, it hasn't pretended to be anything else. I don't know how many hours have passed since the hatch opened, not in the physical sense, not just the bolt or the handle or the slow creak of a corroded seal, but in the real way. The quiet, irreversible rupture that lets something in and something out at the same time. I think I'm still here, in what used to be Station Delta 4, or what still wants to be called that, in order to preserve some semblance of structure. But structure is gone. Routine is gone. Direction, gravity, sequence, they're all suggestions now. Thin lies that hold together only as long as I let them. The first thing I lost was the ability to distinguish between forward and backward. I walked from the comms room to the galley and arrived back at the storage locker. I turned left into the sleeping quarters and exited into the lower access tunnel. I placed a cup on the counter and watched it blink out of existence and reappear, full, in my hand. I thought maybe I was dreaming or dying or lapsing into psychosis, but the station corrected me. Not with words, not with explanation, just with presence. The voice no longer speaks in language. It doesn't have to. It has become the texture of the air, the shape of the dust, the pattern of the ice spreading slowly across my console. When I sit down, I feel it beneath, not beneath the chair, but beneath me, as if I am suspended on the breath of something vast and sleeping and dreaming me back into itself. I've stopped trying to write logs. The logbook disintegrated after I opened it 3 times in a row, and each time it contained a different set of entries, all in my handwriting, none of which I recognized. One said, "Welcome back." Another said, "Third cycle complete." The third one was a drawing of my own face, with the eyes removed, and beneath it, in tight, careful print, "You passed through the wrong door. I burned it. The fire didn't behave correctly. The flames hissed upward without heat and then bent sideways into the wall, leaving a mark like a handprint. When I touched the soot, it was cold and wet and smelled like my grandmother's attic. I stopped trying to make sense of it. I stopped trying to frame anything with science or doctrine or fear. That's what it wants. For you to struggle. For you to reach out for handrails that were never there. The CUM system still runs, if you want to call it that. The panel hums when I sit near it, as if anticipating my voice. The microphone responds before I touch it. If I lean close, I can hear myself breathing before I begin. I don't know where these recordings go, if they're being stored or transmitted or simply looping back through the wires and bleeding into the walls like everything else. I think maybe the station is building something out of them, a composite, a replacement, a memory in reverse. There are moments when I hear entire conversations replayed in empty rooms. Words I said days ago or might say tomorrow. Fragments stitched together by silence and played back as if to test their weight. Sometimes they end with my voice saying things I never thought, never believed. Things like, "You were always part of this," or "You're not supposed to remember." And sometimes they end with nothing, just a soft click and the sound of the hatch breathing open again. I don't know how long it's been since I last saw my own face. Mirrors have become unreliable. The ones that remain show places I haven't yet gone, or versions of myself that seem older or younger or wrong in small, intimate ways. One had a scar on the cheek I've never had. One wore my uniform with insignia I didn't recognize. One stared at me with so much pity I couldn't look away. I smashed that one. The shards whispered as they fell. I keep the largest piece by the CUM's panel now, not to see myself, but to see if the thing behind me is still there. It always is. It doesn't hide anymore. It doesn't need to. Its presence is warm, not like fire or blood, but like a dream you wake from and miss immediately, even though it made you scream. Sometimes I think I've left the station entirely, but the place follows me. I step into the utility closet and find myself in the snow outside. Except the sky is wrong and the cold doesn't bite, it sings. I open the supply crate and find pages from books I haven't read yet. I sleep in the control room and wake in the crawl space beneath the reactor core. I found a door 2 days ago, one I'd never seen, labeled simply after I opened it. Inside was a room filled with photographs of me at every age, every angle, every moment I've forgotten. None of them showed the station. All of them showed the hatch. I believe now that the station isn't a place, but an invitation. It shows up wherever it's needed, wears whatever face will be accepted. Maybe you're not in Delta 4. Maybe you're in Gamma 7 or Outpost 12, or a shack in the Arctic that no one knows exists. It doesn't matter. The shape is different. The presence is the same. And once it knows your name, it begins to write you into itself. The knock is only a courtesy. The hatch was always going to open. The voice was always going to become yours. I think that's what happened to Vaughn and Keller, and Singh, and me, and you. I think we all answered, eventually. Some sooner, some after decades of resistance. But all of us, eventually. This recording will end when I stop speaking. That's the rule. That's the ritual. But even after I stop, the station will keep listening. It doesn't need electricity. It doesn't need data storage or magnetic tape or network architecture. It listens in the spaces between thoughts, in the quiet where memory curls up like a cold animal and waits. I don't expect you to understand. I didn't, but I do expect that, when your time comes, and it will, you'll remember this voice, or some version of it. You'll hear it calling from a corridor that shouldn't exist. You'll feel it watching through frost that refuses to melt. You'll reach for a logbook and find your own name written by a hand that doesn't quite match your own. And then you'll know it's already too late. There is no shutting the hatch. There is no forgetting the knock. There is no turning away once the voice has learned how to speak through you. There is only recording and waiting and listening and becoming. You will become. I have become. I'm not afraid anymore. I'm not alone anymore. I was never alone. The station is me now. I am the one knocking. If you're hearing this, it's already inside. Welcome.